Please welcome to the stage, Chris Heilmann. Growing up in style, what the JS world can learn from CSS. Thank you very much.
Dun, dun, dun. Yes, excellent. Okay, I got the live transcription thing going on. So those two kids in the front already had a lot of fun with that. So if you say bad things, they're going to show up to the world and on YouTube, and people will know it was you. I'm going to talk about what the CSS world can learn, what the JavaScript world can learn from CSS, because I'm old and I've been around for a long, long time. This was me on drugs, I think, and in the 90s. And that's when I started becoming a web developer. I've been 25 years a web developer and 18 years a blogger now. I worked on the largest products, browsers, and web standards. That's not a hyperbole. That basically is I worked on Yahoo.com back then, on the first enterprise content management systems, these kind of things. And I worked on Firefox and then also subsequently on Edge. I wrote 3 and contributed to 15 books. I'm a freelance writer on several news portals. I'm a video trainer on Skillshare and LinkedIn Learning. I was at Yahoo, Mozilla, Microsoft, at eToys, and each of those like 4 to 5 years. Microsoft, I was at 8 years, which is unknown. And sadly enough, not the case anymore. I am a true believer in JavaScript from day one. I really loved the immediacy of the language. I loved that you didn't need any compilation, that you didn't need any IDE. I used command.com first and then later on TextPad to get started. And it was great because I could just mess things up and see the immediate result of what I was doing. I'm also a big fan of accessibility, performance, and keeping the web open, secure, and accessible to all. And that is where I get frustrated with what we do with JavaScript over the years. I'm a user of the web, a creator of its tools. My last 5 years in Microsoft, I was the principal program manager for the developer tools of the browser that are shared with Chrome, so that the Chromium dev tools, not the Chrome dev tools. And we translated them into other languages. I made the color picker accessible, which was a very interesting concept, and these kind of things. And I'm a seasoned veteran of the browser wars, and I've seen the web survive a lot of stuff like Flash, Silverlight, all the cool things that came to replace the web and went away again. So let's have a brief history of JavaScript usage that most of you probably never encountered because you were born into a world where JavaScript was a thing and everybody was online all the time. You didn't have to do the to get connected to the internet and your mom picking up the phone and then you weren't connected anymore. It was just a thing that was just there. So the first things that we did with JavaScript was enhancing server-side solutions, form validation. Basically, that the form didn't get sent off, but JavaScript could say, like, you should have put your name in there. That was the first things that we did because it took about 30 seconds for a page to load when you send a form off. Nowadays, this is in HTML. There's basically, you can do a required attribute on an input element. You don't need JavaScript for this. The user cannot send off that form without actually doing it. You can do it with a curl command or these kind of things, but not the user. Then it was creating cross-browser solutions. The first browser that I used in earnest was Netscape 3, Internet Explorer 3, and then Opera was the other one, and Opera was still paid for, so you had a banner displayed. So I actually cracked the browser to play with it because I didn't want to pay for it back then. But that's the thing that I worked with. And then all of those browsers had different ideas what the web should be like. We had the layers in Netscape, we had divs in Internet Explorer, we had horrible things in Amaya browser, and all these bits and bobs, and we had to do that. And that led to DHTML, dynamic HTML. It's not HTMLX, but it's similar to like making HTML dynamic. It was bullshit. It was not a standard. It was just basically hacking around issues that browsers had. And then we fought Flash, and we failed, because Flash was friggin' amazing. It was great because you had a timeline, designers could just paint things and it would actually be an animation. It was allowing you to do video with transparency that we still can't do in HTML5. And it had a lot of like really cool creative people in it, but it was also horrible because it was not the web. People could not see what you were doing. The view source of the web was not possible in Silverlight and in Flash. Funnily enough, it also gave people this false sense of security. I always loved when you had websites that were like where you could win things and you could play a game. And then you basically had Fiddler running in the background and you just saw that they sent off a REST URL and you just put yourself as the winner in there by just changing one number. And they never checked on the back end that something was going on in there. They just checked it in the Flash file. It was wonderful. Then we had the HTML5 revolution, and we standardized HTML for the first time properly, and by then JavaScript was also standardized. And then we went server-side with JavaScript and made everything JavaScript. And then we declared victory, and we failed to delegate. We basically said JavaScript is the #1 language, nobody's ever going to take it away from us, and it's going to be great. CSS, on the other hand, was always a thing where real developers were like, I don't like that. That's weird. Like, what's that syntax? Why is something going on there? But it was always a thing that to me was off the web and for the web. That sounds like he's of Bajor or something, but it basically means that it was a thing that was standardized for the web and was there to define things rather than just invent things. So CSS, the first thing we did was remove underlines from links. And that was just incredible. Like people, wow. And then you had like hover. And I remember I once won a pitch at a company by showing them that I can change the mouse and then the underlines going away from that thing. And they're like, oh, you know how code goes. Wow, I could do that. And then we hacked layouts. We used like table layouts first, and then we tried to style tables with CSS, which was always a huge failure. And then we actually changed row span. So for SEO, we had the content first and the navigation later. So we painted things with background colors and all kind of weird things. And then we added interaction. Then we had like hover, we had focus later on as well. Now we have focus within, which is friggin' amazing. If you haven't used that one yet, it's just gorgeous because you can style the whole thing around it when you click on something in between it. And you get ridiculously creative. CSS was just used in a beautiful fashion, and it was always a designy competition with each other. It was never like a codey competition, and that's what I liked about it. Then we got typography. Like we finally got fonts, and now we actually load 75 megabyte of fonts because we use one headline with it or something. It was great when before we had fonts, companies always asked me if they can use their company font on their website. And back then, a lot of these companies didn't have internet access outside the company, so they could only use their own products. So I basically said, sure, because I knew all of them had that font on that machine, so I had to do nothing. And they're like, oh, our developer said we cannot use our font. You managed to do it. And I'm like, yeah, don't try it from home. But they didn't have mobile phones then, so it was all good. Then we had animations and transitions, and they were complexly done, but they were beautiful because they were part of the rendering of the browser. With JavaScript and also with Flash, I always had to fight against the rendering of the browser. I had to understand how frames are being built. I had to understand when there's a redraw, refine. CSS doesn't care. It basically is part of that. It renders before the rest of the page. Then we use real layout engines. We now have Flex and Grid, and they became rather complex to look at. But there's cool websites like games to learn about Grid and Flex as well. Again, the CSS community did it a creative way to learn these new functionality. And now we got more programmatic constructs. We got CSS variables, which are like custom attributes. And also we got max, min, we got calc, and all these kind of things in CSS now. And now geometric functions. We even get like sine, cosine, tangents, when you want to turn something towards the mouse. You can do that now in CSS only as well. And we relinquish control, and I'm going to come back to that, because that to me is the biggest part. That's the difference between the CSS world and the JavaScript world. And again, I've taught about this in 2017 already at another event, where I basically said JavaScript is about control. I want to control everything. I want to know what FPS my animation has. I want to know what size this thing has, what size that thing has. And CSS was basically trusting the browser and trusting the engine to do the right thing. If I set a background color, I don't want to care if the browser actually does it in the right color format. If I do it in CSS, I know it works. And it was this like, can these two groups, CSS is too easy, it's not even coding, CSS is so hard, we need to replace it with JavaScript, please talk to each other. Because that's still a thing. JavaScript and CSS was only seen by real programmers as too easy or too complex. There was nothing in between. They never embraced it, they never tried to understand it. And CSS always stayed very close to the metal of the browser and the web itself. It's a true platform feature. It is highly resilient to errors. That's the cool thing. In CSS, I do something wrong. Parser goes to the next line and calls me a dick or whatever, but basically says like, no problem. One error in JavaScript and the rest of the scripts don't get executed. JavaScript is super fragile, and we still trust it with everything that we do. We try to control everything with it. And this is especially important when you think about third-party stuff coming in. When it goes to performance of websites, we as the developers are not to blame. The marketing people that put like ad trackers and like all kind of other things on top that shows like where did people click, this is where it gets slow. So 90% of the JavaScript that messes with the performance is probably not ours, but things that get installed on top of our code. The community finds needs and the standardization process delivers. And this is something that I was really confused about. I was part of W3C in several groups. I was part of the CSS working group. And people always complained that browsers didn't do anything, but didn't ask on these mailing lists. They didn't go on the calls. All W3C calls are free to join. You can just join in and say, like, by the way, I want this. I'm a developer. But nobody did. They just thought somebody would do it and do it for them. Abstractions like SAS and less and these kind of things needed knowledge of another language and infrastructure. You had to install Ruby or whatever to actually start using it. That's where things like CodePen came in, that you didn't have to do it and you can still learn that syntax and do things there. But it wasn't like in the JavaScript world where we jumped on every library and we started using it. In the CSS world, most libraries were used by people that don't want to understand CSS, that just want to have a button that looks like everything else. And that's where we got Bootstrap, where every bloody website looked the same for a year. Like it's 3 buttons, three things, and one big hero image. And you're like, yay, I'm a designer. No. So who was responsible for the meteoric rise of JavaScript? Was it actually Brendan Eich when he invented it in a 10-day anger-fueled rage or something? It was done in 10 days, the language, and it shows. It's a very, very hacky thing. It's beautiful. Was it Douglas Crockford when he actually gave us JavaScript the good parts? He was my first code reviewer, by the way. That was one of the scariest moments in a job interview ever. Or was it Ryan Dahl when he actually did Node.js? Who was the one that actually made JavaScript what it is right now and being used everywhere? Well, I think it was Internet Explorer. Let me explain that. Internet Explorer refused to die. Microsoft sacked the whole team that did Internet Explorer 6 because they didn't need them anymore. And it took years for them to hire more people to do IE7 and IE8 and IE9 and IE whatever count they did after that for as well. And the problem was that it made styling of pages dependent on JavaScript because we always had to patch for that bloody browser, which was the most used browser, and it was hardwired to the operating system, so you couldn't even get a new version unless you upgraded the operating system. That was the first thing that had to get fixed, and Firefox showed that it can be done differently. We didn't embrace new platform features because of IE. PNG was not possible to actually have transparency unless you used an ActiveX filter in Internet Explorer, which was one of those CSS hacks, and that actually was JavaScript dependent, and also a huge security attack vector, but now we had transparency. Yay. Flash embeds was also not possible to actually have Flash embeds and valid HTML unless you had a hack. And we didn't embrace native CSS features because IE. And this was decades. I mean, 5-6 years ago, people were still saying, oh, we have to do something about IE. And most of the time, it was a sad excuse for not actually wanting to do something different. Because IE died a long time ago, unless you were in Korea, China, or in other places where they couldn't upgrade Windows because it was all pirated versions. JavaScript dependency became a common thing to do. And it was just like, well, everybody has JavaScript turned on. The same way Adobe said everybody has Flash installed. And yes, I think turning off JavaScript, and I do it when I serve weird things on the web or do security checks, then I have my NoScript extension there. But turning off JavaScript by default is just things that freaks do. JavaScript will be there, but it's always fragile. It's always a problem to rely on. Because JavaScript was always above the platform, because the hackability and the immediacy of JavaScript, that I can write something and see immediately what it does. Do you understand layers? Do you understand diff? Okay, I give you layers now. Hey, I fixed the web. Now I don't have to care about the browsers any longer. But it's not the W3C standard. It's another standard, and it has a standards body now, and that just became a big thing in the last few years. It breaks super easily, as I said. The community patches ahead of standard support. Whenever a new CSS feature came out that wasn't supported with browsers, somebody came up with a cool JavaScript solution to do the same thing. And never ever got rid of those things. We just kept them somewhere in the background. Abstractions are written in JavaScript and often executed server-side or require a build process. So this is when we started making things to have an installer to actually get started with a website. I still do an index HTML and start writing my stuff and save it. That's how I start websites these days still. Libraries are the norm. Everybody uses libraries. And that's a thing where we went really further with the library thing. Because patchy support and cross-browser differences led to libraries like base.js, IE7.js, both done by the same random dude in London that actually I know who's a really nice guy, who had his server running in his flat. That basically, when IE7, you'll download it from his server at home. That was the only way to get IE7.js. And that was where MooTools, Dojo, and YUI, I worked on YUI back then. And then, of course, the big winner, jQuery. jQuery was always write less, achieve more. Don't worry about the DOM, we fix everything for you. Don't worry about browser differences, we fix everything for you. You can now write dots and chain 15 methods rather than just have a list of things to do. And it's great. It actually got lots and lots of developers into development. It got people started because it didn't feel so daunting. It didn't feel like I have to know how browsers mess up that I can write JavaScript. I just can write JavaScript. And then, of course, people asked me back then, why isn't jQuery in the browser? Why can't you put jQuery in Firefox instead of JavaScript? It's not standardized, that's why. It's a really bad idea to put non-standardized technology in a browser. And if now, 20 years later, every browser would ship with jQuery, that would be another problem as well. Why don't you add Markdown to the browser? That was last year. Because Markdown is great. Yeah, Markdown is also not standardized. The GitHub Markdown is different to the Wikipedia Markdown. Markdown is basically also a hack on top of HTML. And then, Chris, why are browsers so slow and bloated? Because we supported all kinds of things. As a browser maker, you cannot break the web. We have to actually make sure that whatever you write does something. And the HTML parser is the most forgiving thing on this planet. You can just write anything in there and something comes out of it. And that's why browsers are slow and bloated, because we actually work around a lot of things. As a web developer, it was fascinating to me to work on browsers and see the hatred that browser makers have for web developers. Because they basically say, we have to swallow every crap that people put on the web and do something with it because the browser cannot render it. Netscape was great. And if you didn't close a table in Netscape, it just didn't render it. Told you, you fucked up. I'm not going to show that to people. But all other browsers are super forgiving. jQuery taught a whole generation of developers to treat the DOM as a dumping ground. So this is a list in HTML. And this is how a CSS developer would style it. Peach puff, one of the most beautiful colors in CSS. A jQuery developer would do the same list and then write this jQuery. Cool, I don't have to understand CSS, it just does the thing. And then actually it generates this kind of rubbish in the background. And most other engines do the same thing. Every time we write an abstraction, somewhere punishment happens, and most of the time to the browser engine. It does not matter how much code we write. This is always the thing, like write less, achieve more. What you write is much more important than how much you write. It's also like when people measure the quality of an engineer at lines of code, like how many, like when Elon Musk said, how many lines of code have you written yesterday? I can write you 50,000 lines of code that are bullshit. Is that great? No, it's not a measure of quality. It matters what ends up on the end user's devices and how expensive it is to compute and display. And you have no idea what people on the web use, and you have no control over what they use. You cannot tell them you need this and that browser. This is not the web. They have the right to actually use whatever nonsense they want to use the web on. Polyfills became fixed features. I love the idea of polyfills. Basically, okay, we test if a certain thing is supported already, and if it's not supported, we write some JavaScript to fix it. And then basically, if the thing is supported, that the rest of the JavaScript will never be executed. But thousands of polyfills I've seen don't even do that if statement right. They still execute that code even when it's supported, because in the standardization process, the name changed or the function names changed, and a lot of polyfills are still out there. So that we fix ahead of the platform has become a constant race that I don't think is a good idea. We added a ton of useless code to the web because of developer convenience. Like, oh yeah, cool, jQuery. Look at jQuery stats right now, what's live out there. I mean, WordPress is still 80% of the web, and WordPress has jQuery in there. And if your WordPress is outdated, your jQuery is 12 years outdated and is basically a playground for attackers. That thing hasn't been patched for quite a while, so it's a bad idea to rely on that. But we hardly ever clean this mess up, and this is not our fault because we don't get the right to. Our engineering managers, our marketing people are saying, oh, build a new feature, don't clean it up. The biggest lie that I heard as a developer is always like, do it now because we have a deadline and you can fix it later. No, you never get the time to fix it later. It's a lie. That's why when people ask you how long does it take, and you know it takes you an hour, you say 6 hours, because then you actually can have the time to clean it up and fix it as well. The web is full of old and outdated helper libraries that are now a performance, maintenance, and security issue. And web applications are slow. That's why we needed the virtual DOM. Like everybody was just patching lots of things in there. We found like 8 libraries competing with each other, and then basically the web app was slow, and then like, it's probably the DOM, so we should do something different. Let's invent another language, let's find another library and make a virtual DOM, because the developer tools that actually allow you to mess with the DOM are not good enough. I don't know, anything. The JavaScript world has been a lot about updating things, undoing things, rather than evolving lately. Every talk that I see at conferences is about like, how do we fix this mess, rather than like, what is the next thing we put into JavaScript? So we have developer tools show us unused JavaScript and CSS. We automated browsers, like the whole Puppeteer and then later Playwright thing. We basically do build things that do us screenshots and show us the difference in different renderings and these kind of things to find out the most needed code to get a fast first display. We have amazing insights into performance, loading times, rendering times, and. I mean, Google comes up with a different acronym every week of like first input delay and kind of things that I don't understand any longer. And this made it much harder to get started as a JavaScript developer, because you don't need to learn JavaScript. Most of the time you get asked to learn a library, or you actually need to know the stack and the tooling much more than the language. I found it very depressing when people said, like, the first thing I teach people about JavaScript is go to the terminal and install this and that. And I'm like, wait, what? You know, JavaScript, go to the browser, fuck around, do things, you know, like put things in there and see what you can do with it. Did we ever think about using less code and leave the control to the user instead? You know, input type date is supported on every browser. You don't need a 400K date picker that actually has a different background color. This is in the browser these days. And CSS understands this. And the great thing about CSS in the last few years is that it's completely giving up control. We had fixed viewport sizes. You remember, like, oh, here's our breakpoints, 640 pixels, 1024 pixels, 500 pixels. Oh, scroll bar, it needs to be 15 pixel 0.7 and these kind of things. And nowadays, we just basically have Flexbox grid growing and shrinking with the content. And basically does go to the next line when it doesn't have anything, because we have mobile phones, we have toothbrushes, we have whatever that people use the web on. From pixels to percentages to EM, RAM, and viewport sizing to container sizing. This container sizing fonts is wonderful. It's a really cool thing to have. And what do we use instead? Tailwind, where we say medium size 50 pixels, 10 pixels to the right. And you're like, no, this is like inline CSS that I don't want to use anymore. These are all the length properties that CSS has now for you. And you can now count how many of them you've used or heard of. Like Q? No idea. Inches, yeah, sure. I always do my website in inches. But okay, it's print and thing, I don't know, you know. And we set width and height on everything, and then we realized, okay, then it doesn't break to the line. Every time I got designs from people, I translated them to German and sent them back to them and say, like, if that fits in, you have a design, because English is so much shorter. And it breaks into 2 lines, 3 lines. And we set width and height to, now we have auto and aspect ratio. Aspect ratio is wonderful. Diff aspect ratio 1:1 will always be a square thing, no matter what gets in there. It just gets bigger and smaller. 16:9 videos, all kind of things are now in CSS. You got box model definitions, and now we have independence of writing order. So instead of having top left, top right, bottom left, we basically have like begin and end, because it could be a Japanese website that goes downwards, or it could be a Hebrew website that goes to the other side. The web is for everybody, not only for people in the Silicon Valley. It's not California CSS, it's cascading CSS. And these two interact. All these great innovations that CSS has now, you can use from JavaScript without actually having to innovate or actually replace them. You can read and write custom properties. And I love that. For example, I take the mouse position and I just store it in a mouse X, mouse Y CSS property, and then I do the rest in CSS. Because I don't need to do the style change, blah, whatever in JavaScript. I can let the CSS do it, and it has these two variables that it can work with. CSS animations fire events on start, on transition, on end, in every frame as well if you want to, and are part of the browser rendering. Media queries can be used in both JavaScript and in CSS, and they're great for detecting touch, for detecting high contrast settings, detecting dark mode, light mode, these kind of things. And the popover API we talked about in the first day today is one of the coolest things I've seen lately. It's not a feature that I really think was that necessary, but everybody used it for like telling us, please tell us, please subscribe to our newsletter rather than reading the document that you came for. But it actually has all features that you want, that we had in YUI before, that we had in all the other libraries before, and it's now part of the stack. But do we even write JavaScript anymore? I think JavaScript is going full package. NPM taught us not to write solutions, but assemble them from existing packages instead of writing our own. Instead of documenting tricks and finding solutions, we write modules, packages, and abstractions. How many people download our package is much more interesting than what's in that code. And this also, my GitHub stars are the most important thing. And you're like, no, they're not. We delude ourselves into thinking that we work more efficiently and professionally than we did before. But then interesting things happen. This is isNumber. This is the source code of isNumber, which fixes some random things in some older JavaScript engines where it didn't tell you if a number is a number, but it actually gave you a string that was then trimmed and all kind of other stuff. Cool, it fixes something, great, fine. 70 million downloads per week with 2,396 dependencies for that code. Something is going wrong. I'm sorry. This is just what? Like, I mean, probably it's not the developer's fault. There's so many dependency trees that it's like 15 times. I think it's part of Tailwind that actually calls it. That's why it's so many. Even better, is odd. Okay, get the absolute value, check as if a number, throw errors, throw error, throw error, return n modulo 2 equals 1 is odd. Yeah. 136,287 downloads a week. Now, there. Yeah, and then we have, of course, is even. And instead of just taking this bloody code and saying like is 0, no, what they did is actually make is odd a dependency on is even. Because then we can control it, right? This is also a fun one. Exports is module value true, exports default equals null. 700K downloads, 51,520 downloads per week. That code that does fuck all. Because it has dependencies, 322 dependencies as well, so there's a lot of stuff happening there. But the interesting thing is its name. Its name is Dash. That's the name of the module. So why does it have that many installs? Because when people go to the command line and type things, they can npm i foo, or they can use flags. And then they do -g foo to have a global install. Or they put an extra space in and have npm i -g foo, or in the safe, they have an extra space in. And these both are actually how npm i dash gets installed, because dash becomes the name of the module. And this is a huge problem of the packaging manager, that like parts of the Unix command stack can be a name of a package when you have to install them from the command line. We also have I, G, install, and S. These are also npm packages, because we're professional now. We're not doing JavaScript anymore like we used to. Let's stop pretending that we became more professional, I think. We've become more dependent on things beyond our control. And the everything package showed that a few months ago, when basically nobody could uninstall their things or install anything on NPM anymore because somebody made a everything package that was relying on all packages on NPM. So it was a huge endless loop, and the package manager allowed for it. And we're not good at housekeeping. When we are dependent on Node.js and on NPM, we need to update these things all the bloody time. We need to make sure that our systems are secure. I do a video series called Coffee with Developers, and I talked to Matteo Collina of the Node project, and he was just like, it's depressing how many old Node versions are out there. This is on the We Are Developers website as well, on our YouTube channel. You can take a look at that one. Excitement for the tech JavaScript thing has been replaced by excitement about product launches. Everybody is more excited to have a product on GitHub than actually what JavaScript can do. Like group by, bloody amazing. Like finally we have it. I don't have to write these 5 lines of JavaScript every single time that I had in PHP in 1993. Those were in there already. I get the feeling that we're heading for a real mess if we don't focus back on the language and the platform. Think about it. We're just relying on packages from other people, and we're putting packages out without wanting to maintain them, and actually other people are dependent on these things. And the XZ, or XZ as Americans call it wrongly, open source attack is a great example of that. I mean, that was insidious. That was just wonderful. That maintainer that put that malware in there spent a whole year caring for that product for another person, and then he put his malware in because the original developer didn't want to maintain it any longer. And it was found by chance by a Postgres debugger that basically said, like, why is there a spike in my traffic? And if he hadn't done that, we would be all offline right now. The whole cloud infrastructure is all Linux servers, and they all would have been hacked. It's quite impressive what happened there. And today, this video came out where I talked with Feroz Abukadije. I can pronounce that because he said, like, it's Abukadije. So I think, well, hey, Abukadije, yeah, great. That came out today, the interview with him, and he has lots and lots of good stories to tell about what NPM is. Like, the thing that I showed is just the tip of the iceberg there. I think we took on too much responsibility. That is the job of the platform. This is standard bodies, this is browser makers, this is JavaScript makers and JavaScript engine makers that we should demand things from rather than just hacking around their problems like that isNumber thing. The CSS community, on the other hand, did not do that. Instead, it focused on the language and support. It just asked for things. Of course, we learned things from Less, we learned things from Sass, we learned things from whatever other engine was out there. But things we, as the JavaScript people, should not aim for is pixel perfection or FPS perfection display. And this is where we're going back to. Like, I don't build websites, I build components, and my component is 300 pixel wide. No, your component is as wide as it gets space in the main website it's being used. This is what the thing should do. Availability of features currently in standardization before they are ready is also a bad idea because we don't remove these patches, we don't go back to them, we don't clean them up. And matching closed and native platforms one-to-one is probably not a good idea as well. We cannot win against Apple when they actually have non-standard things that they actually have the patent for. We cannot do a force touch on the web because it's pointless. So why are we even trying to do that? And automation of everything. We're super excited about like having a script that does everything. And this is what AI is taken away from us. And this is good because we shouldn't be doing this kind of things all the time. Things we should aim for is control over what ends up in our apps. Code reviews should include dependencies. We never look at the dependencies that our products do. We look at our own code, but like, do we have like 50 outdated NPM packages? Every NPM install I do, I get like 5 screens of random messages I ignore. And all of you do as well. Like, don't tell me that you actually, oh, well, this one needs patching. I'm going to do that first before I keep coding my things that my company pays me for. Contributing back to the community, single maintainers of important infrastructure like the XZ thing is a red flag. And that's with every JavaScript engine out there as well. Just be nice. Say like, hey, I can fix stuff for you. I can write some documentation for you. Being diligent in what we do or for what purpose. There's no need to add the kitchen sink every single time. Whenever people talk to me like, well, I need to build React, and you start with React, I'm like, are you building Facebook? No. So why do you need that? Like, you're not going to need it is a thing that we have to learn as developers. Like, sure, we can put an engine in that does everything, but if it's just a sign-up page with a form in there, no, you don't need 5 JavaScript libraries to do that thing. Maybe it's just a static page would be good enough. Finding joy and playing with JavaScript again. Just do random stuff, just play with it, and just go to the terminal or go to the console in the browser and just type a thing in and a dot, and then look at all the methods that come that you never heard about. You're like, oh, what does that do? That's kind of cool. Let's try that one out. And this is what we have, these immediate products that we can play things. So what about fun? The JavaScript, the CSS community does CSS stuff, but they're also really good about fun. This is like one div, a.singlediv.com. This is all one div element, and the rest is CSS to do all these kind of things with it. There's all kind of cool animation things and a DVD screensaver and all these bits and bobs that people get super creative with. The CSS community bursts with creativity, and that's the one that's closest to the Flash community that I remember from back then. And all the Flash people that I know are now in special effects in movies or in creative arts and these kind of things. They turn their back to the tech world. Most of the CSS-only things are not to be used in production. They're actually horrible. Like, they also punish the browser renderer a lot. A lot of people do like pixel art in CSS by using drop shadows. And drop shadows is one of the most expensive things you can make a rendering engine do. And they just use a drop shadow for a single color. That makes no sense, but it's a great way to make pixel art. A lot of them are used by browser makers to improve the rendering engine. Anna Tudor, a good friend of mine who does the most outrageous things in CSS, whenever she came up with something, we're like, okay, our engine is slow. Let's see what we can do and pre-cache things that she does there and like, what is that even kind of thing. But it was great to have these hardcore tests. And some of them helped the world of HTML emails. There was a talk at Halfstack a few years ago where somebody did like Mario Kart in HTML and CSS by using like, input type password, and you actually do a detection of which key was pressed, and that way you can drive left and right and these kind of things, and you do them for HTML emails. If HTML emails are a good thing, I don't know. They did play a lot more as the JavaScript community. The JS 1K goat golfing competition was just wonderful back then. Like 1K, and you have to write some JavaScript that does some cool stuff. There's also JS 13K, which is still running, which is 13K games, like no dependencies, only code, 13K tops, and there's outrageously good games in that one. And it's so much fun to see that they're all documented as well, and people talk about it. And Andre, who used to work with me at Mozilla, is really behind that. So let's have more fun with JavaScript. Build useless shit. Please, just have fun. Build stuff. But don't make it a package and tell other people to depend on it. You know, build things for your own fun for the bin, and just then try out new features you haven't used yet. Write blog posts about it and share videos and tips and tricks of the language itself. Stefan Judis is like a guy that I know in Berlin who has a really good newsletter that just has like, today I found this on MDN that I totally forgot about. And this is really, really cool to try these things out. And if you find that, I'm happy to promote that on the channels I run. Like, I have a Code 100 competition. Code100.dev is like a game show on stage where people do live coding against each other. I do our Dev Digest newsletter, 150K subscribers. Coffee with Developers video series, and I'm on the steering committee of the World Congress in July, 15,000 people and 600 speakers. So this is what my life is like right now. And that's all I had. So I thank you very much.